Well, the DA has welcomed Parliament's Ethics Committee recommendation to the National Assembly that the EFF Chief Whip, Floyd Shivambu, be fined 9 days' salary after the committee found that he breached the Code of Ethical Conduct and Disclosure of Members' Interests. The committee found that Shivambu failed to disclose payments to him from the Vemba Bank to the tune of 180,000 rand. That is a Sgameka to that correction. The committee says the monies were paid through a company called Sgameka Projects in 2017. It says this was identified through an affidavit from the liquidators of VBS. DA Chief Whip in Parliament, Siviwe Gwarube, says law enforcement agencies must now conclude their investigations into the VBS saga and arrest those who stole money from the bank. Now let's discuss this further. We are now joined via Teams by Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets. Michael, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So Mr. Floyd Shivambu will have 9 days of his salary docked. Is this fair considering, just the sums of money he received and also the fact that he failed to disclose this matter?
Good afternoon, Unati. Thank you very much for having me. I think that it's encouraging on one level that the Ethics Committee has come to a decision. It has taken a long time. I believe the complaint was first lodged in 2019, but at a very basic level that it's concluded its findings, I think is encouraging. I think, to be frank, that the 9 days docked pay is essentially a slap on the wrist for what is a very serious, potentially a very serious breach of trust not to make those disclosures. But I think that perhaps even more importantly, the bigger picture that we need to keep in mind is that the Parliamentary Ethics Committee was considering one tiny sliver of the broader story of how Floyd Shivambu and other politicians and the EFF more broadly may have received a lot more than 180,000 of money that ultimately had been looted from VBS. That is an issue that needs to be taken up far beyond the Ethics Committee, as we said, by law enforcement and other agencies, and much more stringent consequences do need to be seen.
There are obviously calls, that the investigations into this matter now need to be concluded, just given this particular development. This is a case dating back to 2017. What do you think needs to be done, from an investigation perspective, but also just given the fact that, as you also say, that this matter was taken up by Parliament?
So what's important to note is that Parliament had a very limited amount of information before it. So Parliament has admitted that, for example, it was not able to receive information from the Financial Intelligence Centre, which said it would not be appropriate to provide that information to them. That information goes to law enforcement. But Unati, I think the point that you make is a really important one here, is that once again, the VBS matter more broadly is an example of where we see some movement, in the sense there have been some arrests, for example, and there have been people brought before court many years ago now who have been officially charged with fraud, corruption, money laundering and other crimes. And yet, just a few months ago, that case was delayed yet again. And there have been delays both on the side of the National Prosecuting Authority, but also more recently from the perspective of the courts. And this has a massive impact, I think, on public trust, where we see such an egregious economic crime with such terrible consequences for depositors and other people who are impacted at VBS. And yet the movement from arrests to an actual trial and then actual consequences is so slow. And then the thing I would add to that is that then has a knock-on effect to other processes. And so we've seen already Floyd Shivambu indicating that he's going to take this decision on review. The EFF still broadly denies anything that happened at VBS was incorrect, or any of the money that they received was implicated in wrongdoing. And I think that their denials, though not supported by the evidence, are easier to make when the criminal cases are not finalized. And that's why we need swifter justice and more efficient conduct, both from the side of the NPA and the courts.
And of course, another important thing is accountability, right? We know that accountability on this very matter, the VBS saga, has not been enforced, especially at a political level. And this might be a question, obviously, that you might not be able to answer, but how much should we read and question in terms of the timing of this decision, just given the political climate?
Well, I think that, as you said, there are two different types of accountability here. The one that I've spoken to most has been on the side of law enforcement agencies and independent institutions. And I think as citizens, we obviously have an incredible interest in those independent institutions doing what they need to do to hold people to account. I think on the other side, I think what we increasingly see is that we have an unfortunately very similar conduct by political parties across the South African spectrum of a failure to take responsibility and accountability internally, and a failure to hold their own members to account for their conduct. The irony, of course, is that as South African citizens, we're incredibly frustrated by the corruption and the economic crime we see across the board. And our political parties are much more interested in throwing mud at each other and very unwilling to look at themselves internally. And in this particular instance, as I've said, that is evidenced most strongly by the continued denials of the EFF leadership that there was anything untoward with the money that they received in various ways, despite the extensive evidence both in the public domain and before court, and of course that has been brought by other institutions such as SARS as well.
And just talking about that evidence, and as we wrap up our conversation, of course, the Ethics Committee saying that a lot of the information that they had obtained was documented, with the liquidators of VBS, as you rightfully point out, that the extensive evidence is there in the public domain as well as in the hands of law enforcement. What would you like to see happen in the next couple of weeks, particularly because this is seen as some form of a win for justice?
So I think that it's unlikely to happen in the next few weeks, but I think that the absolute priority here is for us to see the criminal case moving forward, that it needs to move to trial, that both sides need to be heard. And then we want to see a decision on the criminal front as soon as possible for those people at VBS who have already been charged with crimes linked to VBS. And I think that's absolutely essential going forward. And then I think that we need to see what the courts find, both from the criminal side, but also from the tax implications. And then the public needs to have that evidence when we weigh up the denials. What we also need to just recognize is we need to go back to some of the admissions that have been made by other people, including Floyd Shivambu's brother, who did admit in a fairly secretive agreement now 2 years ago that nearly 5 million of the rand received by Sgameka, his company, was received from VBS for nothing, essentially for no services rendered. And I think what Floyd Shivambu and others are now trying to do is they're trying to use denials that completely ignore what we've seen come out in the last 3 years. And it's also incumbent on us as the public to go back to that information that has now been coming out over a very long period of time and weigh up the denials of the politicians against the documented evidence that's in the public domain from the liquidators, from law enforcement and other agencies.
Michael, really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show. That was Michael Marchant, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets.